But to give you an idea of what this means, out of that conference came a people's agreement. And just to compare one aspect of it with the Copenhagen Accord, which came out of Copenhagen. Copenhagen is saying we must impose a 2 degree Celsius limit for global temperature increases. And then in 2015, we'll have another evaluation to see if 1.5 degrees is achievable. The People's Agreement says that there must be average increase in temperature must be limited to 1 degree Celsius with an eventual return to pre-industrial levels of greenhouse gases. That may be over a period of hundreds of years. Now, the point here is not so much the detail or the limit. The point is the difference in thinking between the two worldviews, because the Copenhagen one is about determining exactly how far we can push the system before it collapses. In other words, all the science is looking at, how far can we go? How far can we push things before it all falls down? In other words, what's the maximum exploitation level that we can go to? The People's Agreement is very different. It's talking about health. It's understanding that we are part of what is effectively a living system and saying, what is the healthiest level? The science says that we know 1 degree is safe, so that's what we must aim for. 1.5 might or might not be safe. 2 degrees, as we heard yesterday, is getting pretty risky. But the real thing is, in the long term, you aim to achieve the healthiest state for the system, and as far as we know, that's pre-industrial levels. So it doesn't matter if it takes you several hundred years. The objective is health, not determining the maximum level to which you can exploit. So what would it look like if we started governing people as if we were part of an Earth community? In other words, from this different perspective. And might I add, I think that the scientific evidence for the dominant mythology that we are separate from and superior to the rest of the planet and nature is almost non-existent. In other words, we are fooling ourselves by structuring our governance systems on what is effectively 16th and 17th century science. So think of our current economies and our societies as a huge oil tanker, and we want to turn it because we know it's heading towards disaster or an unsustainable future. But how do you turn something huge with a lot of momentum? Well, you've got to look at the rudder, and most rudders on big vessels have a trim tab or some part of the rudder which you've turned first, creates a bit of drag on the one side, and that helps to turn the enormous rudder, and eventually that makes a change. Now, initially when this happens and you begin turning the rudder, you don't see anything happen with a ship. But the difference is that once you have turned the trim tab or the rudder and you predict the future, if you don't turn it, you know the ship will end up over there in 10 years' time. Once you've turned it, you know it'll end up over there. So the crucial thing is how do you change course in governance? Well, one of the things you have to do is plot a new course. So some of the countries in Latin America are already changing from aiming at GDP growth to what they call living well. And as you'll see, it means something different. It doesn't mean, as in most Western societies, living better than your neighbor. So your neighbor gets a better car, you've got to get a better car. Then your neighbor's got to get a better car because you've got a better car. So it's insatiable. This talks about living in harmonious coexistence with nature. Now, in another period of crisis, out of the horrors of the Second World War, we got the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. What happened is people said, we cannot allow this to happen again. There's something fundamentally wrong with how we have structured our societies if we can produce this kind of abuse of human beings. And so we are going to set a baseline against which all countries are going to be judged and all peoples. Now, it's important to appreciate this was not a legally binding document, but it played a very important role in establishing new norms in society. It also said you have human rights by virtue of the fact that you exist, not because your government gave them to you or because the court gave them to you, but because you have come into being as a human being. Now, one of the interesting developments that came out of the Cochabamba conference was the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth. And I was privileged to be the international president and led the drafting of this document. But part of what this is an attempt to reflect this very different worldview in law, in the language of the law, which the international community can understand. So I'm just going to give you a flavor for it. I've just pulled out a few bits of it. This is something from the preamble. But you can see that it starts off with reflecting that worldview of ourselves as being embedded as part of nature. And indeed, if you look at that evolutionary story that I described earlier, it's more correct to see human beings as a particular manifestation of Earth, one of the forms that Earth has taken, rather than something separate. We are so integrally connected with the whole. And the insight is that by only recognizing the rights of one part of that community, we've created an imbalance. But it also recognizes that to guarantee human rights, it's necessary to recognize and defend the rights of Mother Earth. In other words, your human right to life isn't worth anything if there's no water. And the way you ensure there's water is by protecting ecosystems and the functioning of the Earth. And this is a people's document. It's intended that it would go forward to the United Nations, but whether or not that happens, I don't think that's the most important thing, although it is being taken forward. Now, it's really got three main articles. The first talks about Mother Earth, and this is just a part of it. But the recognition is really that we humans have used the term rights to engage the machinery of the state to protect certain important relationships between human beings. And we haven't done that with the rest of the planet. In fact, quite the contrary. We have entrenched, we've hardwired an exploitative relationship between human beings and other beings into our legal systems. So if you think of a situation when we called some human beings property, we called them slaves. Now, it's not hard to see that if you have a slave owner, which is a legal person entitled to rights, and a slave who is property and not entitled to rights, there will always be an exploitative relationship between the two. And that is exactly the relationship which the law has put in place between human beings, and anything that is not a human being or a company is property. So you can see that part of the problem is that our system is designed to facilitate exploitation of nature and human domination. And it makes sense if you come from that point of view of human beings being separate and superior to nature. It makes no sense if you come from a perspective of being part of nature. It talks about the inherent rights of Mother Earth. And here's just one of them. You'll see the right to continue their vital cycles and processes free from human disruption. So this is the kind of right that would be infringed by activities which cause climate change. A large part of the document is devoted to the obligations of human beings. And this is where it really bites, because the real issue is how do we humans act? What are our duties? Not just our human rights, but our human duties. And you'll see one of them there. We must respect, protect, conserve, and where necessary, restore the integrity of the vital ecological cycles, processes, and balances of Mother Earth. And every human being is responsible for respecting and living in harmony with Mother Earth. Now, this is a new phase. The phase that we need to move into is the phase of understanding ourselves as an integral part of the whole, and understanding that the way to pursue human well-being is through the health of the whole, not at the expense of the whole. And really what this declaration is it's the DNA of an entirely new society. Because if you took the provisions in this declaration and you began to give effect to them, you would structure an entirely different society which is consistent with the greater system of order within which we evolved. In September 2010, a group of people met at the foot of this volcano in Ecuador and established a global alliance for the rights of nature to take these ideas forward. This is very new. The website's not even up, but already people, Vandana Shiva's organization from India, Maud Barlow from the Council of Canadians, the biggest NGO in Canada, are joining, and I think that it'll begin to gather force. And already, just over 2 years ago, Ecuador adopted a constitution which has rights of nature in it. So this is happening. It's already started, and for reasons which I can't fully explain, it's accelerating. But just to end off, what might the implications for the future be? And I'm just going to touch on a couple of points here. First of all, if we govern people as members of the Earth community, there is a primary system of order, of law. Earth effectively has a seat at the negotiating table. So we have to also recognize that there is a different interest besides human interests. And conflicts must be resolved in a way that maintains the integrity, balance, and health of the whole. That means we shift to looking at relationships and two-way relationships, because exploitative relationships are one way. They benefit the exploiter. But of course, that's not sustainable. If you want sustainability, you have to have mutually beneficial relationships. We have to measure success in holistic terms of health, resilience, etc. And I think, perhaps more interestingly, that we may be seeing the emergence of a very new kind of global politics. There are going to be new alignments. The difference between environmental and social justice activists is disappearing. For example, the Declaration provides a common basis or platform or manifesto for many social justice organizations. Also, the difference between the state and civil society is beginning to be eroded in some areas like Latin America, where the People's Conference, governments were invited to attend, but the final session was the people reporting back to the governments on what the people recommended. So a reversal. These ideas also being taken by states into the United Nations processes. A common agenda and language for social and environmental activists enables the emergence of global and local alliances, alliances which function both very specifically in areas and globally. I think as the crises deepen around food, water, refugees, etc., this has the potential to build mass support for this kind of approach. I think global civil society and local governments will drive the change. I think some of the governments will follow, a few of the governments will lead, but really I think these issues are far, far too important to leave to governments sitting in places like the Bella Center. Some commentators have commented that earth beings are now political actors. In other words, we used to people talking about political parties, even though they're abstract entities, being players on the world stage. But now we're talking about people who fight battles against mining on behalf of a sacred mountain, etc., on behalf of Mother Earth, etc. So this is entirely new in global politics. And I think as this develops, we might well see sanctions imposed by global civil society on who they see as climate criminals, boycotts of products, isolation of parties which are seen as the most important. For example, in the fight against apartheid, there were tax made on the finances, the people who financed the apartheid state. Is it not inconceivable that more and more pressure will be put on those who finance activities which harm the climate? In fact, it's already happening. And perhaps we'll also see a reform of the corporate form, because corporations are designed by law to be exploitative. This was somebody who had a great impact on me, an American Catholic monk who died last year, Thomas Berry, and he pointed out that we had this wonderful dream that technology would bring human happiness and leisure to us all. We now know that that's not going to happen, and we need to replace it with this new dream, because the dream drives the action, and that's why these mythologies, these stories we tell ourselves are so important. And to end off with, this is Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu, Nobel Prize winner who lives in Cape Town, and he has said, "We are not masters of Earth, entitled to dominate and exploit her natural resources for our own selfish ends, but privileged participants in a wondrous and sacred community of life. The Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth calls upon each of us to embrace our kinship with all the beings of the Earth community, and to recognize, respect, and defend the rights of all. Now is the time to answer the call." So I leave you with the thought that, are we going to be wise enough to play by the rules of this community? Because right now we are members of the most beautiful, incredible community we've been able to discover in the entire universe. But unless we expand our ideas of community beyond the human to include the whole and play by the rules of that community, we will be excluded from it. Thank you.